Lachlan McDonald, who heads up the procurement practice of Boston Consulting Group, known as BCG. And I'm joined by my co-host, Carlos Ponce, just outside of Mexico City. Welcome, Carlos, and welcome, Lachlan, to the show. I know Lachlan is chiming in from Australia. I am here in Los Angeles. So we've got a pretty big difference in hours. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I know it's early morning there. So let's get to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about Lachlan. What do you do? Where you come from? Let the audience get to know you a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently living in Sydney, and I've got a beautiful wife and two beautiful kids. So I'm very lucky. But I grew up in the Hunter Valley in Australia, and came from a very small town of about 1,000 people, and spent most of my childhood dreaming of how to get out of that town. And that kind of journey took me to joining the army, and then from there kind of going on through college, doing law, and then falling into procurement. And it was really through an ex-army contact that I joined the procurement practice, originally at BHP, which was or is the world's biggest mining company. And I ended up very much back in that same small town. So, fate has a sense of humor. And, from there, I've spent my career trying to help companies manage their supply chain and their supply ecosystem in a more value-driven and data-driven way. And, that journey has taken me to firms like Caterpillar and Santos, which is an oil and gas company. And there was a lot of challenges that I had at each of those companies dealing with the friction that they had in dealing with the outside world. So they had the best intentions, they had excellent people, lots of talent, but trying to be really efficient in contracting to the outside world was a long bureaucratic process, and there was so much value it was very difficult to capture. So I ended up starting a startup company, and I invented the world's first variable rate geolocation-based smart contract for blockchain. And the theory was, if it was for logistics, and if we could get every truck in the world to be able to have the right capacity information on an online platform, we could reduce things like half-filled trucks, non-optimized routes, and late deliveries. And late deliveries in a mining context means trucks are shut down and you're not operating. And that kind of journey has now landed me at Boston Consulting, where I am one of the leads in the procurement practice here in Australia. And BCG is a global management consulting firm. And our job is to kind of help our clients tackle the biggest challenges out there in the world today. And that could be COVID response and looking at how to drive risk management into complex global supply chains, or help governments stand up contact tracing apps and manage the crisis, through to how to win the 20s. And I think the frontier from a procurement perspective is how to get data-driven contracts to give you real-time payment information that you can then leverage so that you have a much lower total cost.
Thanks, Lachlan. I'm looking forward to having a conversation today, especially based on the topic, because historically, procurement has been very relationship-driven, as we know, but that's more shifting towards a more scientific approach to things. And there's challenges associated with that shift, especially when a lot of enterprise companies have done it in a different way. But before we go into all those conversations, Carlos, please introduce the topic today. Let's get this going. I'm looking forward to having this chat.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Tulio. Today, we're going to be speaking about digital procurement, or in other words, how data-driven contracts make us more resilient and effective in today's world, right, Lachlan? So first question I have for you, Lachlan, for our guest, is this: why did you choose this particular topic? Why did you think it was relevant for today's conversation? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. So it's a great question. And the reason it's so important is that procurement, I think, is... What's happening?
What, Julio?
Okay?
I think we lost him. Is he frozen?
No.
I apologize. It's me then.
It was you.
Please continue.
So digital procurement. Right?
Yes.
So procurement itself is how a company buys, all of the things that they need to continue to operate. How do they interface with their supply chain and the world around them? And that's full of friction points. A lot of it isn't data driven. The contracts effectively take a lot of effort to negotiate and then get put in a drawer. And taking a data driven approach to a contract means that you are enabling your teams to make decisions in real time. So an example of that could be a current logistics contract that you may have would set you up to make phone calls or send purchase orders through to a logistics carrier to put orders on the truck for the day. But you can't see all of the other orders that truck needs to collect to actually get full and then travel to its destination. So it travels when it's ready, not when you're ready, or you pay a premium for that time window. Having a data-driven approach, you can actually see the capacity or what truck is scheduled next to go, and you can make better decisions as to, should I pay a premium to get this moved faster, or can I afford to push it to the next travel window?
So, Lachlan, is that done manually still today, or is there some automation built in that helps me determine, for example, which truck route or which truck company to leverage based on available rates and availability? How is that evolving today? Obviously, we didn't have that kind of visibility just 5, 10, 20 years ago. How is that evolving, and what opportunities is that creating for enterprise companies to get better and maybe even reduce cost in terms of logistics?
Yeah, so the answer is today, most firms are still doing it in a very manual way. So they will negotiate with one, maybe two carriers. They'll have a written contract. If they're more mature on the digital curve, they may have that contract entered into an ERP system. They'll have a plan for what they need to move, and they'll draw off that ERP as needed. But that's effectively it, right, for many enterprises. And there's no kind of automation around how to bundle the right and pack the right kind of truck configurations, whether you actually then auction that out to a select group of carriers who can then bid on those containers. That's actually not live today. So the challenge is the data exists. So what you need to move, when you need to move it, it exists. The capacity, the completion information on behalf of the carrier, that also exists. What doesn't exist is the architecture to kind of triangulate that together. So everything's broken into silos. Being able to drive kind of value through that data is, I think, the next frontier for procurement.
That's interesting. I remember 15 years ago going from the supply chain ERP space, in the IT space, into digital media, and thought there was a lot of transferable lessons learned and opportunities in a marketplace that was predominantly driven by spreadsheets at the time, right? And since then, the digital media industry, specifically the ad tech industry, has evolved with real-time bidding, with basically it's all data-driven now. And it sounds to me now that the logistics space or the procurement space could borrow some of the technology and learnings from that industry in terms of automating things like you just mentioned, parsing out the best routes or the best trucking company to use for a particular set of shipments. What's holding enterprises from pursuing that? The data's there, so what's the challenge? Why is it not happening?
So it's a great question, right? And there's probably a couple of ways to approach it. So the first is that there aren't many use cases in some industries on how to leverage those digital tools to open up the value of a data-driven contract. And another example could be having full-time visibility of all of the workers that come and go in and out of your facilities, and then paying those contractors based on the hours that they actually worked, and then automatically and overlaying some optimization algorithms over the top to ensure that they have the right safety equipment, that they're in the right areas at the right time to look at whether there's bottlenecks or not, right? So some companies are leveraging digital tools, but one of the real challenges is the data architecture underneath. Oftentimes we've tried this before, or we've got a digital strategy, but it's 5 years in the future. And my challenge to them is we need to do this now. And the right way to do it is to fail fast, do it in an agile manner. The data exists, and I think the use cases speak for themselves in many of these industries.
So if we borrow from something like EDI, which has been around a long time for I'm dating myself here for retailers, right? That became a standard way of basically back-end platforms to communicate each other to deal with things like inventory and placing orders, et cetera, which has enabled just-in-time inventory in many cases. Am I hearing this correctly, that in terms of logistics, in terms of procurement, even though the data exists, there's no exchange that connects them all together so that can happen? Is that what's going on, and is that an opportunity for someone to come up with that?
So absolutely. So it really depends on the industry. So some industries are further ahead on utilizing digital tools on that kind of curve, right? Other industries fall further behind. So if I think about the mining industry, it's a massive global industry, particularly important here in Australia. And the example used is a great one. That doesn't exist in a mining context, right? So there's no kind of ability to have any optimization or sharing of information across third parties here in regards to logistics. So the carriers do that and they optimize for themselves, but it's also hard on them because they have very low visibility as to what's actually coming from the companies. They effectively just get an order and they have to move it as quickly as possible. So it's not optimized for the mining company, who is effectively sending quite manual orders without any view to kind of optimization to a carrier. And the carriers have to kind of optimize on the spot and take the risk of, will we have the same volume today as we did tomorrow? And the end result of that is they have a lot more trucks usually than they need to, or the delivery windows get pushed out and you then have to pay a premium to move your goods faster.
So I'm curious about, let's just shift a little bit about the cultural aspects behind the logistics business. It is, especially in manufacturing. Would you say that it's predominantly been relationship based, right? So you might have an older set of people working in that industry. So how are like millennials, for example, new generations that are adapted using technology and automation, coping with that kind of environment? They come into an organization and like, what the heck are you guys doing? All this is manual. So what can enterprises do to transition to be able to leverage data, to be able to leverage automation? Because not only is it going to help their business, but it's also going to help seat the kind of employees they would want to hire that would want to take on those roles that would otherwise probably not be very interested in doing something that looks like from the 1970s, 1980s. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think companies have really focused on optimizing their operations, and all the companies that I've worked with have had, a great talent and a great kind of work ethos around trying to optimize that operation. But maybe the art of the possible was missing at times. And I've lost count of the amount of times I've had conversations with everyone from the shop floor to the C-suite saying, why can't we just Uberize this? Or why I get this on Amazon and it's here in a day, why is this so complex and difficult? And one of the main drivers of that is that the operations have been optimized in a silo. And then once they go to interact with the world outside, right, they haven't optimized how they interact with their supply chain. So how do they move things? Their vendors, who's providing them those critical goods. An example would be a global steel manufacturer who's found it incredibly complicated to actually move the steel around both Australia and the world. And one of the main reasons is that they have no visibility on their their customers' orders, which makes their schedule really complex to manage. So they just have to move the steel coils as quickly as they can, and they can have 100% difference on a daily basis on what trucks they need.
Interesting. Thank you.
I'm not. I'm not. Well, I'm not an expert on this specific subject, and to be completely honest and upfront, this is rather new to me, from the non-technical point of view. But I'm curious about because it's a data-driven approach. How do you deal? In this day and age? How do you deal with what I know to be called as dirty data, for example? Or the data integration, and how to avoid all the challenges that come about these scenarios?
So that's often the first question that we get asked. And it's because people really struggle kind of trying to mine value or drive insight with the data that they have. There's often not perfect compliance to how you use an ERP system, for example. You may have many of your transactions have just been free texted, so they don't actually tell you what you're buying. It could just be engine, not what engine it is and who it's from. So you end up with this kind of historical legacy that is then really tough to tackle, and everyone says, oh, this is kind of too hard, right? So there's a couple of ways to approach it. The first is that in my history, in my experience, there's actually that data, that dirty data can be incredibly rich. So as long as I understand the overall trends of what someone is purchasing, who they're going with, and what the gaps actually are, once I define how big the gap is on what I don't know and what it's worth, I know how to pursue it. I can go to the vendor, I can fix the data inflow outflow system. We can tackle it if it's an architecture problem, and we can start to, in an agile way, chip away at getting a much clearer, more visible picture. You can also be kind of hypothesis driven. So if we know that, if we continue to talk logistics, that a significant amount of the value is lost because we have multiple trucks showing up to carry only one package, even if I don't know what's in that actual package, I know that that's a significant lever of value and that I want to bundle them as much as possible. So I need to know what we're moving. I could go down and manually count it. We could fix the data ingestion and we can continue to move from there. So the way to tackle that is the data is really rich and you should try and improve it in an agile way instead of, well, we'll do a 5-year project to completely fix our architecture and everything will sort itself out.
Okay.
Yeah, dirty data is data that hasn't had contextual analytics applied to it yet sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you, what about data transformation?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the steps that companies need to take is thinking about how do we leverage data in our everyday kind of operations, and particularly with our suppliers. And one of the main, I think, opportunities for data transformation isn't just compliance to our data practices, fixing our architecture, potentially updating it so it's not as manual to utilize ERP systems, for example. It's looking at, well, how do our main suppliers or our main customers use data? Because that's really never tackled in a technological kind of transformation in many companies. They're very internal focused. And I think the main way to approach data going forward is to have a very external focus view on it. What's important to my top 10 suppliers and top 10 customers? Do they have the same friction points in their ERP systems, in their operational systems, their planning systems? And how can we potentially leverage that data across this ecosystem, right, to have benefits that are a win-win? So not just kind of optimize in a silo, but have more ecosystem or network effects.
Thank you so much. Tulio, please.
Yeah, so I'm curious to learn what triggers the sort of a red flag to say we've got a procurement problem, we need to go fix this. What are some of the telltale signs that an enterprise should be looking out for that would trigger having a conversation with yourself and your company to go and solve that? What are the sort of delineating factors that would awaken someone and say we've got a problem? What are some of the things you've seen that trigger that?
A great question. And oftentimes the kind of red flags are very similar. So the first would be that the business is in some kind of strife. Usually a procurement transformation is triggered by the company operating at a loss, or they're being kind of outcompeted, or they need to fundamentally change their strategy, right? That shouldn't always be the trigger for procurement transformation, but it often is. The second is, how are they actually operating procurement now? So what's their kind of year-on-year savings targets, their ability to kind of innovate? Are they leveraging their supplier network to have those network effects in the business? Or are they having kind of fundamental challenges in the foundation of procurement? And some of them could be they have very low formalized contract numbers. So most of it's informal, it's on the phone, manual, kind of bureaucratic ways to buy things, right? The next is, have they actually gone through and systematized the rate structures that they should have in place for each of the categories. So procurement's usually managed in categories. So, fleet management, so everything with wheels on it will be managed in one category, and then labor, whether it's blue collar, white collar, will be managed in a different one. And one of the other kind of telltale signs is how long does it actually take to put in a contract, and what's their overall contract percentage. So oftentimes you'll see a 12-month cycle time. Tenders are being utilised heavily. We didn't get the right answer, so we negotiated. We went back to tender. It took us a year, and only 50% of what we actually spend, so say we spend $10 billion a year, $5 billion is on contract, $5 billion is uncontrolled. So they're usually kind of the warning factors for a company that has probably a team that's working really, really hard, but has bureaucratic kind of manual processes holding them back, or doesn't have the right seat at the table with the senior folk in the business.
So what I'm hearing is, it becomes more like an emergency when there's a downturn in business, a pandemic happens, and you've got to figure out a way to shave costs. However, it sounds to me that it could be strategic if you get ahead of it, and actually could impact your margin. Are there studies in terms of what industries are not doing such a great job in automating this or leveraging data for procurement and logistics that could actually have an impact on their EBITDA? What are those?
Yeah, so I think if I speak from kind of a global perspective, some firms are quite mature in a digital procurement sense. So automotive industries, for example, or potentially pharmaceuticals, by the nature of their business over time, have become quite, they manage procurement in a strategic way. Right? So it's one of the main value drivers of the business. It's delivered significant margin uplift over time. Many industrial goods players, particularly not just here in Australia, but in the developing world, so if we think about China and India, have really focused on scale, labor arbitrage, and trying to optimize their operations in a lean way. But they haven't necessarily looked at how do we get the most value out of procurement. And some examples of that could be mining, oil and gas and steel companies, where there's been lots of effort to negotiate really hard on getting the right prices. But the total cost of ownership, so what's actually driving the cost in the contract, isn't always well understood or tackled.
Interesting. Sometimes you're pursuing what you think is the low-hanging fruit, but the opportunity is in the back end. It's in the getting your operations in order and optimized. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. It's great to learn these developments. From a usability perspective, or let me rephrase that, from an adoption perspective, what have been some of the challenges? I know for a fact that one of our clients is in the digital procurement space, and one of the things they learned was behaviorally, even though if you put in place a new procurement process or agreement or standard or policy, whenever there's something that comes up that's urgent, people tend to go back to leveraging the relationship they have, working with the vendor that they used to work with, and that doesn't always necessarily turn out to be the most cost-effective way to solve the problem. So changing behaviors to adopting technology, to adapting automation, isn't always easy. At least that's what I've learned from my limited experience in this. So what are some of the things that enterprises can do to ease that process of transformation so that there's better adoption for that kind of change? What has worked for you guys?
Yes, so absolutely right. There is a stasis that exists in organizations that really seem to resist change. And people also get change fatigued. It seems like every 5 minutes there's a new directive, we're doing a new transformation, something else is happening. So how do you really get the value out of that change or the kind of digital procurement offering that's potentially there without burning out the people? And I think the way to do it is you have to invest in empowering those people. Right? One of the ways that you can do that is to make the job less bureaucratic and remove roadblocks. So one thing that procurement can do, or procurement transformation can do, is to identify all the areas that drive work into teams that take them away from delivering value for the business. right? And in procurement, that can be significant. You've got lots of suppliers to manage. There's lots of complexity. Oftentimes, the processes internally in a company mandate that you must go to tender. You must kind of do these, bureaucratic steps to drive value, when it's actually kind of doing the opposite. It's just making people really busy, right? And I think, one of the other challenges is how do you invest in people over time, right? And I think taking an approach to simplicity is important. But the other one that I've found personally really powerful is to show them the value in actually doing it a different way and make them the heroes. So if you can demonstrate that by taking a hypothesis-driven approach to reducing utilization under a contract instead of price. So if you're trying to renegotiate a fleet contract, for example, for 10,000 cars, and you can prove that the price doesn't matter so much as you've got 2,000 too many cars that don't move, right? They sit there all the time, you're paying for them, and you kind of lead them to that answer. Then they become real kind of advocates for, we should think about the total cost of our operations. And then they spend all of their time kind of focused on, how do I help the business by using these tools and these methodologies and this kind of digital analytics, instead of, I'm just going to shepherd this tender process through, try and negotiate a price saving and move on to the next thing.
Yeah, I have to introduce you to Q Merritt after we're done with this conversation, because I was blown away by the fact that one of the things they learned was people tend to go back to what they're used to. So adopting a new technology or a new process isn't always easy. So what they did is they created a model where a plugin would just pop up in front of the checkout button of wherever you are, whether you were at Lowe's or Home Depot, whatever, if you're a small business trying to buy back some equipment or trying to fix a refrigerator or what have you, where it would basically push that order through the platform and systems that have been approved for that organization. So I thought it was brilliant, where their mindset was, we meet the client where they are instead of having them meet us where we are. So I have to introduce you to them, because I think that you make a recommendation. They're definitely a great company to know about. So we're coming up on time. You've had a long journey in this space, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned in terms of getting organizations to adopt change when it's clear the analysis shows they should, but they don't pull the trigger out of fear of doing it differently, or if people not adopting it? What's been your experience and things you've learned, any wisdom you've learned in terms of how to get organizations to rethink that?
Yeah, so how to be an agent of change is a really great question. And I think the simplicity and power of your mission is the starting point. So how relevant is it to the overall mission of the company and to kind of the culture and mission of the people that and the talents you have in the company is a great starting point. It serves as kind of a North Star. And oftentimes you don't have a simple and clear mission that leads to value, right? And the second is really kind of try and decentralize the decisions. So if you can push decisions down to the people that are at the coalface, as we say, or at the shop front, and actually get them to try and drive the change, instead of having a very kind of top-down managerial, thou shall do this and I'll monitor you style, because that often it can be quite counterproductive. It takes a lot of time and it's not very agile, right? You're slow, and I've found that we should hire smart people and kind of get out of their way instead of spending all of our time kind of telling them what to do. So I think that really change has the best stickiness when it's really organic, and that's because you've given everyone in a company a real reason to push and strive for it and care about it, and then you've let them get on with it.
Well, it sounds like what I've heard is decentralized decision-making, empower people to make better decisions, get out of the way, and you'll probably get a lot better adoption versus the command and control, do this or else kind of a model. Thanks for being with us. It's been a pleasure, very informative. We will make sure we provide your content and contact information on the page of this show. Thanks for being with us again. Carlos, what do we got coming up tomorrow or Thursday?
No, actually, it's Thursday, Tulio. The next interview we're going to be having is on Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, right here on Dojo Live, and it will be with Shannon Hoagie. She is the global head of solutions and engineering at Carrot and Carrot.com, and we're going to be speaking about interviewing engineering, or fixing the broken technical interview. Because Carrot, that's what Carrot does. It's a automated recruiting platform, so it should be interesting for recruiters out there. Again, interview engineering, fixing the broken technical interview. That's on Thursday, right here on Dojo Live.
See you Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific.
See you Thursday.
Stay safe, everyone. Just stay with us as we wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you.